Hey everybody, this is Joe Turner, and before we jump into this interview with Scott Jorgensen, an Oregon City Administrator, I wanted to unpack it a little bit. So Scott is very unhappy with how he was treated by the Oregon City County Management Association concerning an ethics investigation or an ethics complaint that was lodged against him by another city manager. I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit for you heading into the interview so you have some context. Now, apparently, Scott had come across some listserv comments made by the city manager who was being critical of his elected officials or of his governing body or whatnot. And Scott happened to have a friendship with one of those elected officials because he used to work in the state legislature and has been around the state in numerous capacities as a journalist. So he comes across these negative listserv comments by the city manager. Now, Scott used to be a city recorder. He reaches out to the city recorder for the city, and basically the recorder confirms that, yes, there are some issues, there's some dysfunction or what have you going on in the city. Now, the way I understand it is that Scott reaches out to the elected official who he's friends with and gives him a heads up and says, hey, you might want to take a look under the hood. It sounds like things are a little bit off track, and just a heads up on that. Apparently, this gets spun up into some accusations that Scott had leaked listserv emails or comments to this elected official. Where this appears to get kind of dicey is that the elected official then starts looking under the hood, asking questions, and apparently the city manager of this community decided to record the conversation surreptitiously between himself and his elected official, who is also friends with Scott, and it was the basis of this surreptitiously recorded conversation that becomes the foundation for a supposed ethics violation lodged against Scott by the city manager. That is the context for this discussion that we're going to have. Now, before we jump into the episode, I wanted to give you a quick update about the American Association of Municipal Executives. We opened the doors on Monday. We are in our soft launch. If you signed up to be a founding member, you should have received an email with a registration link inside of it so that you can go in and sign up and be a part of the community. We already have people who have signed up, but I'm getting reports that some people have not received a link. If you have not received that link, you can go to www.community.aame.org. That is community.aame.org, and you can sign up there. I will also have a link in the show notes to the site, the landing page, where you can register to become a member. Really excited about it. Have really good feedback from those who have already signed up. As I have stated numerous times in the past, this is an historic, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you to get in on the ground floor of an organization that is changing the way public administration works. We are going to create a community for city managers. We're going to work on personal and professional development. And in addition to all that, we are going to be advocates for city managers. We're going to educate elected officials and the public about issues of concern and importance to the city managers and other public sector executives. So if you are a public sector executive, if you're a city or county manager, if you are leading some other public agency and you want to be a part of this organization, I encourage you to sign up. If you're an assistant, deputy city manager, or the equivalent, I encourage you to sign up. And if you're aspiring to become a city manager or an assistant city manager or the equivalent, I encourage you to sign up. We are completely reimagining what a professional association for public sector executives should look like and what it should do. We are forming a community. We're creating connections. We're building relationships. We're championing each other. We're supporting each other. We are helping each other achieve our personal and professional goals. So if you want to be part of this group, if you want to be part of our tribe, our community, if you want to feel connected to a group of like-minded souls, I encourage you to go to aame.org and sign up today. And with that, let's turn to the interview with Scott Jorgensen, the Oregon City Administrator who has a major issue with how he was treated by the Oregon City County Management Association during an ethics investigation. All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. I have with me today a very interesting guest, Scott Jorgensen. He's the Rainier, Oregon City Administrator, and we're going to talk about some issues he's had before with the Oregon State City County Management Association, the ICMA chapter, when it came to some ethics concerns. And I think it's going to be a pretty illuminating conversation. Scott and I, we've had some pre-interview screening calls, and he's got a fascinating story, and he's also just a colorful character. And before we jump into that, all those details on the ethics issues, Scott, why don't we tell the audience a little bit about yourself, because you have a pretty unique background when it comes to city managers.
I started off as a small town newspaper reporter, so I've covered city government in all kinds of jurisdictions over the years, which has actually come in handy in my new role because I've seen what approaches work, which ones don't. Got a really good sense of council dynamics, seen different approaches used by different managers, who's effective, who isn't, and was able to get some good mentorships in that time. I also spent some time working in the Oregon State Legislature, so in both the House and the Senate, caucus office, majority, minority, super minority, but ended up, chief of staff for a couple of state senators from Southern Oregon. And while I was doing that, I attended graduate school. So Portland State University, Marco Hatfield School of Government, graduated from that in 2017 and been with the city of Rainier for the last 4 years, just under 4 years. Before that, I was with the small city of Aurora, historic town halfway between Salem and Portland, for about 2.5 years. I've also published 4 books about Oregon history. One was a series of interviews with former Governor Vic Attia right before his passing. The other was an oral history of the public life of one of the representatives I worked for, Dennis Richardson, who went on to be Secretary of State before he passed in 2019. Been in something like 8 different bands, maybe 2 of them were good.
Yeah, we talked about that in the pre-screen call. You have a band, and in fact, in lieu of band practice today, you and I are doing this interview. You and I have some things in common. We both around the same age. I'm 47. You're 44, right, Scott?
Yes.
And you have a Southern California root, so we're born and raised there up to teenage years, like I was, and we both listen to some of the similar types of music, and so you have a little bit of a harder, edgier sound with your band. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. We still try to make it melodic, but um, I've always been into that, the heavy rock.
My big influences when I was growing up was I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I was definitely very angry as a young man,
Hmm.
as a young teenager. So I was into Corn and into the hard stuff, and Biohazard, the early Deftones and Tool and whatnot. You know, and then I got into a System of a Down too in college. I was really a big fan of System of a Down. So not sure if you ever. I know we talked before about how you are into some of those bands, but were you ever into System of a Down?
Oh, I think Toxicity was one of the best albums of the aughts, like, hands
Oh
down.
man,
Yeah.
when it first came out and I heard it when I was in college, I was like, "What the hell is this?" It just blew my mind when that album came out. I was like, "There's nothing like this out there."
Yeah, exactly. Very unique, and they have this ability to go from super melodic, almost dancing along, to just hitting you over the head, right? And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
lyrics are good too. I mean, very profound. Those guys had something to say.
Yeah, I loved that album, for sure. One of my buddies, one of your peers actually, Brandon Dross, he's in Lafayette, Oregon, but he's from New York originally, and he's actually has some musical talent. I don't have any musical
Really?
talent. I can hum a sing, but he was in a band that actually opened for Biohazard back in the day,
Oh,
and
that's
he was a drummer.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So he's a drummer. I don't even know if he still plays really to this day. I think it might be sort of in the rearview mirror for him. But he opened for Biohazard, which I was a big fan of. I don't know if you ever listened to Biohazard or not, but
Yeah, no,
the
their contribution, they did a really good song on the Judgment Night soundtrack. I think the movie itself was probably terrible, right? But they
that's a
teamed
great
with
soundtrack.
it is. So it was all these metal bands teaming with these rap acts. They teamed with Onyx to do the title track, and it was great.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Helmet was on there too. I was a big Helmet fan. I'm not,
Yeah.
yeah, they have some good stuff there. So,
I think that the singer of Helmet was from Southern Oregon, Medford, right?
oh really? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
On the Biohazard, they have a live album out of Germany called No Holds Barred, and I just think it's phenomenal. If you ever need to rage, and you want to turn something up, and you want to go do a little raging, you definitely want to listen to the No Holds Barred. The Biohazard live album from Germany is pretty intense. But anyway, like you have this really interesting, crazy background. Like I said, you elaborated on have some political experience, journalism experience, just musical background that you have. What made you decide to get into city management?
Well, I loved reporting. I'll just throw that out there right now that I really enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the interaction. I liked being paid to meet people and to learn things. And it was, I mean, it was a breadth of knowledge that I got in that day in and day out, which has actually helped considerably as a city manager. And it was fine when I was in my early 20s and single, but then you have a family to support. And plus, the industry itself, even here recently in Oregon, it's been more of the same where you have reporters being laid off, newsrooms being gutted, a handful of companies owning the entire media, that mass media consolidation. So,
Yep.
I think just about every news outlet I worked for got sold or went out of business, and you can only have the rug pulled out from you so many times. So I mean, I just needed something steady and something that paid a whole lot better than reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I get it. I get it. But so when you were working in the legislature though, because I used to work for a state, well,
Down in Temecula,
yeah,
right?
yeah, we talked about this in our pre-call, yeah, for the audience sake. But yeah, I used to work for a state legislator in California and a county supervisor in Southern California. And so, when you work on the legislative side, there's a lot of different opportunities or avenues that you can go when it comes to being in that world, right? Going into consulting, the campaign
Oh,
consulting,
absolutely. Yeah.
different types of public relations work with some of the different shops or whatever. There's lobbying, obviously, as well. So, what was it about the profession of city management that you're like, hey, I'm really gravitating towards this?
Part of why I wanted to work in the legislature in the first place was to help out small towns, because when I was covering these local issues, a lot of times I found that these well-meaning, well-intended volunteer city councilors and the staff of the city were besieged by unfunded mandates from the state and having their hands tied by bad policy at that level. So
Right.
because I was young and naive and didn't know any better, I thought, okay, well, let's go to let's go to Salem and see what we can do. And that's an interesting world, but you can get a lot more done at the local level, even in spite of all that. And if you have a background in it like I do, I think you can be a whole lot more effective at helping to push back against bad policies and to successfully advocate for your city. So I think I've been able to do that over the years.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about city management, and I've talked about this in different episodes or on LinkedIn posts over the years, is that you can really put your thumb on the scale and make a difference. And one of the things I really find fascinating about the profession is the feedback that you get can be pretty, I don't want to say instantaneous, but you can see feedback pretty quickly, right? Whereas at other levels of government or other professions, sometimes you don't see the progress occur for a couple years or more. But when you take over a small town, for example, like I have, you can literally make a night and day change, whether it's the financials or how things are getting done in a very short period of time. And that's what I find pretty sexy and intoxicating about the profession.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. I can get more done at the local level in months than I could in the legislature in years. And in that setting, you see some of the same bills, even if they're good ideas, they don't pass for whatever reason. And sometimes it has to do with partisan politics. Sometimes it has to do with the Republicans decided to leave, right? So that happened a
Yeah.
couple of sessions in a row. That was after my time, but here you are at the local
Or
level
well,
trying to get your priorities advanced, and oh well, I guess the session's over.
Well,
So,
for the sake of the audience, you might want to just do a quick little primer. So, there was some partisan battling going on between the Democrats and Republicans in the Oregon legislature, and I believe many of the Republicans just decided they're going to ditch the Capitol and flee so that nothing could get done, right? So they wouldn't lose some votes, I would imagine, right?
yeah, and my last session was 2018, so they actually went. It took them a while between then and now to complete a session. It kept happening. And I know these guys, right? I mean, I worked with them. I can call them on their cell phones right now, and I understand why they did it. I mean, there had been discussions about doing that years earlier. And it's a breakdown in process. I mean, it is what it is. But if you're a small town and you're relying on that, you're going to the state to fund a project a critical infrastructure project that you need, It kind of puts you in a bad position. Well, I guess, gee, we'll try again next session and hope that they stick around and get it done.
That's an interesting point you bring up there, Scott, because I recently started reading a book by Brooks Williams. He's a Ferris, Texas. I believe he's a city manager in Ferris, Texas, and he wrote a book called Rising to Serve, and I just started it, and I'm literally only through the first chapter. And he basically talks about in the first chapter of his book, some of the issues facing the public sector and what have you. But one of the points that he makes or talks about is how the federal government and state levels of government, they can get away with doing things that we can't get away with at the local level. Namely, not balancing a budget, for example, or printing money at the federal level, or kicking the can down the street, unfunded mandates. It's like, everything at the local level, it's like there's no backstop there, right? You have to tackle it, and you have to address it, and you can't avoid it. And I find that fascinating when you talk about the way the state acts or the way the federal government acts, because it creates a lot of challenges for local governments. Because at the end of the day, we are the ones, or when I say we, the city managers, the elected officials, the citizens, the employees, we are the ones that essentially have to answer the call, right? We don't get to shirk our duty day in and day out.
Well, yeah, and because of a lot of what they do, and because of the increased toxicity and the increasingly partisan environments at the federal and state level, people are angry, right? But the average person can't afford to go to Washington, D.C. and go yell at their U.S. senator. A lot of folks can't afford to drive across the state to go to the state capitol in Salem and yell at their state representative, but it's
That's
pretty
right.
easy for them to go to City Hall and yell at whoever's there, and that happens to be us.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
sometimes you deserve it and you have it coming. Sometimes you realize that people are just angry in general at government and you just happen to be the closest. It is what it is.
I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing a lot of the breakdown with, with the for the federal at the federal level, things becoming so partisan, right, and so divisive. I sense that a lot of folks, the reason why we're seeing such toxicity or volatility at the local level, is the fact that so many people feel so disconnected and alienated from the federal government, from their government in general, that that's the place that they can go to vent and enrage and express their frustration.
Well, and you had things like this, right? The homeless situation, especially here on the West Coast, is a result of court rulings by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that essentially served to tie the hands of local governments. So we had a situation last summer where we had a marina and we had a homeless guy hanging out there. And okay, I mean, we had our ordinances that we passed, but people don't understand. Oregon had passed a law in response to one of those rulings that created a cause of action. So essentially, if the city does too much, goes overboard in enforcing its ordinances on a homeless person, then they can then turn around and sue the city. But
Yeah,
people didn't realize that. They just see this homeless guy hanging out causing problems. They assume that we aren't doing anything. What they didn't see was the amount of time that myself, our chief of police, one of our officers, endless amounts of time. And we finally did get him into permanent housing, which is great by working with community action team, working with his probation officer. But it was exhausting and we were getting beaten up out there in the meantime. I mean, people were mad. I understand why they were mad, but they didn't quite understand the fact that we can't really do anything. And unless you
yeah,
guys all in town all want to buy this guy a house, you know, our chief of police is going to obey the law. And we have processes that we have to follow in ordinance, and the ordinances have to pass muster with state law and be
yeah.
consistent with these court rulings. But the average person doesn't spend much time reading court rulings, so I
No,
wouldn't expect them
no.
to get it.
No, and Brooks Williams talks about that in, like I said, the opening chapter, this disconnect between what the people, the average citizen, understands or what they see going on or what they don't see, but they don't understand what's going on behind the veil, so to speak, of local government and all the different things that we have to either abide by or follow or what have you. And so there's a massive disconnect, and I'm not really quite sure how we solve this problem, to be honest. But it's a vexing one, and I think it's going to get even more challenging as time goes on. It's hard not to be pessimistic at times to think about where this profession's going and where democracy in this country is going, because I think we are in a place in time where sometimes the average citizen, I think, has lost lost track of the fact that democracy is a participative, it's a participatory sort of event, right? You have to be engaged, and it's tough because a lot of folks don't want to get engaged, or they don't feel like they can get engaged because their voice isn't heard, and it creates this vicious cycle. But be that as it may, I don't want to get too far off in the weeds on the state of the American democracy. Before we jump into the ethics issue with the Oregon City County Management Association, you started in Rainier back in 2020, right at the height of the pandemic. Or I
That's
think
right.
like September of 2020. What was that experience like? I mean, it's hard to believe that's already been 4 years essentially since that happened, but it was such a huge moment in time for this country and obviously for a lot of city managers. I recently had Jose Madrigal from Durango, Colorado, on the show, and we talked about his experience there. And he went months before he even had face-to-face interaction with some of his subordinates because of some of his executive staff, because he had entered he became the city manager during the pandemic as well. So, what was it like for you going into Rainier in September of 2020 at the height of the pandemic?
I think it was kind of different in small towns because it first hit when I was in Aurora, and we didn't close City Hall because here was my office. All right, 6 feet in any direction, 12 feet in any direction. Okay, we're good to go. Next office over is my assistant's office, and clear on the other end of the building is the finance officer's office. So, in terms of social distancing and everything, we were fine. And then everything else is public works. Well, they're out in the field, they're okay too. I
Right.
think a lot of local government became very unresponsive. In fact, I lost a lot of respect for many of my colleagues during that time because I was on the OCCMA listserv, and if you want to know what your average city manager was doing during the pandemic, they were on calls with each other all day, every day, making excuses as to why they can't do their job because of the pandemic. Now, there were only a few of us that stood up in that time and said, well, gee, I don't know, should we try to figure something out? I mean, we're all getting paid here. I mean, it would be embarrassing. You'd go to a nearby community and you'd go to the park and the grass is up to your waist, and you're thinking, so sending a guy out there on a lawnmower is somehow going to spread this virus? I don't get it. And remember, and this looks horrible in hindsight all these years later, filling up skate parks with sand, right? Putting
Mind
things
boggling.
on basketball hoops to where people couldn't use basketball hoops. I mean, they literally like, we're going to lock you in your house, and your
It
local
was
government
insane.
officials are going to be unresponsive. The state government in Oregon was a disaster because you couldn't get a hold of anybody. You still can't get a hold of anybody years
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
So it did.
It,
It resulted in this kind of breakdown, but we tried to be better than that. We were subjected to some limitations along the way. We had in Rainier, our 100-year anniversary of our city hall building. So we figured out a way to do a socially distanced open house event. And we were careful, we were methodical in how we did it. And it went off without a hitch. Nobody got sick. So I think if you really wanted to remain responsive, you could.
yeah.
But I think a lot of people chose not to, and chose instead to just collect paychecks and sit and whine and say, oh, well, gee, there's just nothing we can do. So yeah, I became pretty disgusted with a lot of my colleagues during that time.
Wow, I didn't expect you to go there. So shots fired here by Scott Jorgensen for sure.
Yeah,
But you know, in Kansas, it was very interesting because we had a shutdown for a little while, but it was only for a little while, and we were basically all in the office working. We had City Hall closed for a couple weeks, but we were still in the office working, if that makes sense. And
right. Yeah.
it boggled my mind because, and I don't want to get political, but obviously some of it's obviously naturally political. But we had a small town. I worked in a at the time I was in a town of 1,700 people, and small town Kansas, you don't have a lot of amenities for the
Right.
people, the public.
Yeah.
It's just,
I,
it's
I
rural
get it. And
Kansas.
maybe in larger cities, you have more employees packed closer together.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you probably shouldn't work somewhere where you're within 6 feet of anybody else anyway.
But we had a public pool, and it was the only amenity really available for those kids. It's outside of a little park that we had. And this pool's out in the outdoors, right? It's in chlorinated water, which we use to
That's
sanitize
what
our
I
drinking
mean.
water, right?
Yeah.
It's out in the sunlight, and you have the governor and the county threatening us for wanting to open the pool. Meanwhile, it's okay for a bunch of senior citizens to go to the state, run casino and handle poker chips and stuff. You know what I
Well,
mean? It's
same.
just
Like
like, what
all
is
the
going on?
dispensaries in Oregon were still open. Um, And you could still go to Costco. You
It's
just had to follow
laughable.
the arrow, right? So if
Yeah, it's
somehow
just
this was the
laughable.
smartest virus on earth and it didn't tell the difference between a small company and a Fortune 500 company, that if you did business at a Fortune 500 company, you were somehow immune. Um,
Yeah, and it's like, I wasn't expecting this conversation to go this past, so because I don't like to beat the drum on James Freed every episode that I do, but it's hard not to, and that's one of the reasons why the James Freed story resonated with me greatly is that I felt that this was a politically motivated hit on him over this whole COVID and the mandates and all this other stuff, because I feel like some of our colleagues, our peers, and elected officials have just went absolutely batshit crazy during the
Oh
pandemic
yeah,
on some of this
I
stuff,
don't disagree, and that's why I'm fine with this as a segue because that's when I first started. I mean, when I was a rookie starting in Aurora, I didn't mind belonging to this association. I thought it might do me some good. I'm thinking, okay, I'm new to this. Now, again, I did have some background because I'd spent a significant part of my adult life going to city council meetings, reading the council packets, talking to city councilors, talking to
Right.
city administrators. So I had probably less of a learning curve than a lot of people did coming into this thing. But, okay, surely there must be some value to this association. And instead, what I see, getting access to this listserv is city managers making excuses for not doing their jobs, complaining about their city council, complaining about the mayors, complaining about their citizens, and all the while they are using public emails. So, well, let's talk for a minute about the nature of this listserv. It's
Yeah, yeah.
essentially all these people sending emails.
Well, before we get into that, right? So
Yeah,
I should I gotta share something with you. So I've never been on a listserv, so I've never been a member of the ICMA at the state or national level. So I've never even been a part of the listserv. And this is going to segue into the conversation about this ethics issue that you have some concerns about. And I got to remind the audience, remember, Scott Jorgensen was a journalist and worked in the media, free speech and
and
freedom of
public
information, act
public
requests, and all that
records to
stuff.
me are
Yeah,
sacrosanct, absolutely
yeah.
sacrosanct.
Yeah. So this listserv, and for those who are listening who are not who are uninitiated, is essentially it's sort of like you ask a question to a whole group of people via email. You send out an email, and then the answers come back to you via email. It's almost like a reply all to everybody. That's kind of like a very simplistic explanation.
Sure.
Um, but this is what happens: is you have a lot of city managers on these listservs who are using their city-owned email account. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're sending messages from their public emails to the public emails of colleagues and officials from all throughout the state. So you would stand to reason it's all public record. Every last bit of this is public record. And so, as I'm starting my career as city management, as I'm on this listserv, I saw it increasingly. And, going back to this, to a previous life, I remember my training, my first legislative session as a 24-year-old, a year and a half out of college, they really emphasized to us do not put anything in a public email that you wouldn't want to see, repeated publicly, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you automatically knew, and they should know. And I would. I mean, at times I would be kind of appalled at some of these things that these people were saying about essentially their bosses, right? When you're a city manager, your city council, your mayor, that's your board of directors.
Right.
So maybe maybe things aren't going well at work, right? You get done at the end of the day, you come home, your wife asks you how things are going, you say, "Oh, these guys are driving me nuts." That's one thing. But
Right.
it's another to use your email, your public email from that very city, and not even necessarily the mayor and the council, but even citizens. If you're bashing citizens, if and I understand that there's some frustrations that hey, we
Oh,
can
yeah.
all relate, but again, bear in mind, it's all public record, every last bit of it, whether you
Right,
like it or
right.
not. But some of these guys treat it like, oh, this is our safe space. It's not. It isn't.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about this, Scott, is there has been interesting discussions. So I have I call this person, I've never met this person, don't know their name, this disgruntled spouse of an ICMA member, right? And this person's put in public information requests throughout the country related to ICMA executive board members trying to get information, talk about their junkets that they're taking, their golf trips, and so forth and so on. Okay.
Oh.
And this individual put in a public information request in McMinnville, Oregon, and McMinnville basically said, we'll give it to you, but it's going to cost you like $9,000 essentially to get these emails, right? And it was like basically this very outrageous sum of money in order to get access to these documents. And then you have other areas like Texas, for example. There's a city manager out there in Beaumont, Texas, ICMA board member Kenneth Williams. This individual put in a public information request for Williams' ICMA emails, and the city argued that the ICMA emails were not official city business or not related, therefore not subject to disclosure. But yet you have city managers, in this person in particular, who's having their dues paid for by the taxpayers, who
That too.
is going to
Yeah.
conferences on paid for by the taxpayers, who's in the contract is saying that being a member of the ICMA and professional development is an important part of your is
Yeah.
an important part of your obligations, and it brings value to the community and so forth and so on. And so it's interesting because not only do you have the stonewalling of the in some areas where they're trying to charge exorbitant sums to get access to these records, you have other areas where they're trying to essentially say that ICMA activities aren't city business or aren't related to the city at all, so therefore they're not subject to disclosure. And I think they're wrong in both instances. So
I say it's nonsense. I mean, it's one or the other. And yeah, I'm sensitive when it comes to that stuff, partly because of the journalism background. But the former House member that I mentioned earlier, one of my mentors, one of my bosses, he had run for governor in Oregon in 2014, and there was a scandal brewing in the governor's office. There was rumors that the first lady was using her position as first lady to land lucrative green energy consulting contracts for her private company, and the
ah
lines between first lady and CEO of that company were blurred because she'd show up at meetings and people to where the governor's staffers, multiple of them were resigning, right? And that was the first sign that something was going on. So news outlets put in public information requests to these state agencies to get these emails. Well, these agencies, there's two ways of doing it. One you mentioned was charging exorbitant fees, and the other is just stalling them out. And
right.
so these public records requests made to agencies under the control of this governor stalled out these record requests until after the election. And then after the election, they released them. And then it's painfully obvious what was going on, right? The reporters were right that,
Yep.
yes, she was using this to benefit herself. And a dear friend of mine could have been governor, could have changed the whole trajectory of the state had we had good public records laws in place. And I worked on that in the legislature, and that was part of why. You tell me again, $9,000. If you're the average person, right, or even a reporter, a small town newspaper reporter like I was, you turn to me and you say, "Oh, sure, yeah, we'll give you those records for $30,000." You say, "That's as much as I make in a year." They say, "Yeah, we
Yeah,
know." Right?
I know.
In the newspaper outlet, unless it's one of the biggest companies around, a ma and pa newspaper outlet, they're not going to pony up $30,000 for a records request. Now, if you actually incur a cost, that's one thing. I've been on all sides of this. I did a public records, I filled a public records request the other day. You know what I did? I printed off two emails and I scanned them and I sent them to the guy. Did I
Yeah,
charge for
yeah.
that? No. Why would I? Sometimes people do fishing expeditions, and I get that. So we had one of those when I was in the
And
Senate,
there
and that
there
involved,
and there is abuse for sure. Yeah, there is
yeah,
abuse. Yeah, and again, we've all been on all sides of it. I've been an activist. I've worked for elected officials, and I've been a city manager. So I've seen all aspects of the equation. And by and large, I think you need to defer to releasing the information for free as much as possible, because I just think that's what you should do in a transparent, open government.
yeah, and I think there was a cost for that fishing expedition in that it took a couple of hours of my time to sort through all these emails to make sure that nothing needed to be redacted. When I was with the city of Aurora, they used to have a police department, so sometimes people would call would-be employers for a guy that was a reserve officer, and so I would go to the office behind me, pull out a box, find the files, scan it, and
Yeah,
send it to them. I'm not going to charge
yeah.
for that.
Yeah. Let's segue now to the specific issue you have with the Oregon City County Management Association, because when you shared this with me, I was I was gobsmacked by some of the things I learned about this from your experience. So why don't you unpack this a little bit for the audience? It all starts with you receiving an inquiry. I don't know if that's the proper word or not, but the OCCMA reached out to you and said, "Hey, you're being accused of an ethics violation." Is that correct? Is that how this whole thing started?
Yeah, that's correct. But it's anonymous, right? You say,
Right.
okay, so
Right.
so who filed this complaint? Well, we can't tell you. And again, I think this is very poor policy. It's a bedrock of American jurisprudence, and even well before the founding of this republic, we're talking, a few thousand years here, that you should be able to face your accuser. So that was the first problem I had with this. And the second was, I said, okay, there's a complaint. Can I see the complaint? No, it's an anonymous complaint. You're not allowed to see it. Okay, well, is there any evidence? Like, what's going on here? What am I being accused of? Do I get the chance to see this? No, no, you can't. So then over the next several months, they said, okay, well, now we're doing fact finding. So these different members of the ethics committee would, basically harass me, asking me these questions. And some of them were very leading questions that had kind of an assumed answer built into it. Why did you leak this to the press? And I'm saying, hey, wait a minute. For one, what are you talking about? For two, I didn't leak anything to the press. And for three, they're saying that something got from your listserv, again, where people are using their public emails, right? That's a public record. So you're bent out of shape because something that is a public record ended up in the hands of the press?
Well, but
Okay.
see, so let's put a fine point on this because this is what I find fascinating about the ICMA ethics process. Okay, and I have a lot of heartburn about it, even though I've never been a member. And I have a little bit of a story to share because back in January of 2023, the ELGL put me on their top 100 influencers list. And literally, it was like 2 days after I first posted about James Freed, and then
Mhm.
literally, like within the 2 or 3 days of that me being put on the list, I was taken off of the list, and I'm like, well, what the hell happened here? So I reached out to ELGL and said, hey, why the hell was I taken off the top 100 influencer list? And they said, well, we received several members or individuals have expressed concerns about your political background, your activism on illegal immigration issues, and some other allegations about my conduct in the workplace. I'm like, what? Okay, I've what are you talking about? So at the time this happened, I've never been investigated or anything for an HR related thing as a city administrator, city manager, or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I was like, what are you talking about? And yeah, I did have a political background as an activist on illegal immigration issues. Okay,
Because you worked
so
in the legislature in Southern California,
well,
right?
and it's like, okay, it's like,
Kind
so
of a big issue
what's the
there.
deal though? I want the laws followed, right? That's my big sin. I want the laws followed.
Right.
But my big problem with the ELGL was it wasn't, hey, we are going to investigate the claims and do a fact finding on whether or not these claims against me have merit.
Right.
They put the burden on me to explain or answer some questions on these complaints about me that have no basis in fact, or there's no substantive to the arguments that are being made. And so they basically said, well, we will, if you are willing to answer some of these questions, and I don't have them in front of me right now, but if you're willing to answer some of these questions, then we'll review the situation and reconsider adding you back onto the top 100 list. And I'm just like, no, I live in America. This is not a banana republic. Like, if you're going to tell me exactly what the charges are against me and what my violations are, and the funny part is my activism on illegal immigration is I want immigration laws enforced, right? But yet, that's a bad thing supposedly. But yet James Freed, it can get railroaded because he supposedly was going to violate the law, some made up law on vaccine mandates. So the ICMA on one hand is okay with railroading a city manager because he supposedly was going to violate a law, right? But then yet I get railroaded because I wanted the laws enforced. It's just like this complete hypocritical bullshit that's going on with these organizations. But my main point of this whole thing that really frustrates me is the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty, except that the onus then becomes upon the person who's received, being complained about, then it's on you or me to somehow defend ourselves against these vague and anonymous charges. It's just absurd.
So I literally asked them for a year, right? Anytime it came up, and then go about my business, and then they'd come back, well, we've got more questions for you. And I said, cool, can I see the complaint? Let me know when I
Yeah.
can see the complaint. And they just refused.
So again, so after a year, to make this to put a fine point on this for the audience, Scott, after a year, you've gone through this whole ordeal, but you don't even know exactly what the complaint is against you, right? You've just been asked to answer questions. And you're like, why am I being asked to answer questions when
Yeah,
I don't even know what I'm even being accused of doing?
right. It was this whole dance. And in the meantime, they're threatening, right? They say, oh, well, we'll shame you publicly. And well, I'm thinking, yeah, if you do that, lawsuits are going to fly, you guys. Really, you're going to do that? You're going to try to defame me based on what? I still don't know what this is about. So a year after the fact, right after this all starts, they finally say, okay, here's the complaint. and it's from this manager, and the complaint was based on a secret recording that he had made between himself and a friend of mine who was one of his city councilors. So right there, I stop and I go, wait a minute, this is a secret recording. Are you kidding me? Now, it's not illegal in Oregon, right? Because Oregon's a one party state. But I'm a Washington resident. You can't do that here. So I actually looked into it, right? I looked into all the different states and their laws. And many states, including some of the most populous ones, what he did would have been straight up illegal. So I filed a complaint against him and said, hey, not to be a jerk, but really? That's
Right.
even if it's not illegal in Oregon, is that ethical? And I'm thinking about this, and you get this, you've worked for elected officials. If at
Yep.
any point you had secretly recorded conversations between yourself and the legislators that you worked for, you would have been done in that business forever, right?
Yeah, you're gone. Yeah, yeah, you're done for sure.
Same thing with this. And I consider the mayors and the councilors that I've worked with, many of them are friends of mine. You have to maintain good relationships with these people. And
Yeah,
I think if your average city councilor in Oregon knew that a city manager was secretly recording conversations with a city councilor, they wouldn't be too happy about it.
right. So, okay, so let's unpack this then. You have a situation where after a year of being accused of doing something, or there's an allegation made against you, but you don't even know what it is, and then after a year goes by or so, the ethics committee for the Oregon State chapter of the ICMA says, "Hey, this is what happened. Somebody provided us with a recorded conversation between themselves and their elected official that they work for, and they were basically expressing concerns about some activity some action you may or may not have taken, essentially, right?"
It was more like what happened originally, right, the year before, was that this manager was on there griping about his mayor, saying, "This guy's making me miserable, he's harassing staff," and I commented on there and said, "You need to tell your council." And so I knew their city recorder, right? I was friends with their city recorder, so I asked her, I said, "Hey, what's going on over there?" And she told me, right? She confirmed, she's like, "Yeah, things are bad here." And this friend of mine was a city councilor, has been a friend for a very long time. I was a groomsman in his wedding, so we talk all the time anyway. So in one of our conversations, right, I said kind of in passing, "Hey, I talked to your city recorder. Um, you might want to go talk to her about what's going on there.
Yeah,
I hear things are getting bad." So somehow that got twisted into this allegation that I'd somehow leaked, this original posting that he did, again, public, using his
right,
public email to other public emails to the local media, which I didn't do. And, that was my response to them. Well, even if I did, so what? These are public records, you guys. You're supposed to be
right.
guardians of public record policy. So yeah, that a year after the fact, here's this recording, secretly made without the knowledge or permission of my friend who was the city councilor. And it also occurs to me right away, these guys knew for a whole year, they sat on this. They knew that this was a secret recording, right? And they knew the nature of that. Says, well, no wonder you were trying to keep this from me the whole time.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
took it one step further and I did a public records request for that city. So, okay, if this is a recording of a conversation between your city manager and one of your city councilors, that's a public record, right? Isn't it? Wouldn't it
right.
be? They had
Yeah,
they had
theoretically,
no
right.
knowledge, right? The city, that actual city government had no idea that these recordings existed.
Which is not a
So,
surprise, right? Because the city manager who did the recording is not going to go out and volunteer the fact that they recorded when they're elected officials, right?
yeah, and by then he had already been fired for different reasons. And what was funny was that my friend was the only member of council who didn't vote to fire him because he didn't attend that meeting, right? But even then, when he'd reached out to him initially the year before, it was as a friend. It was, hey, I heard that things are bad here at City Hall. How can I help? So he's
Yeah,
trying to help this guy, who then somehow twists this into an anonymous complaint and attacking me.
Well, so here's the thing, Scott. So the idea though of this call, so in Oregon, Oregon's a one party consent state. So there was no illegality on the part of the city manager who recorded his elected official talking about the situation, and it just got spun up into you getting, this allegation or this complaint made against you.
Yeah.
But under ICMA Code of Ethics, and again, I've never had to abide by the ICMA Code of Ethics, and I'm just genuinely curious from your perspective, does the ICMA Code of Ethics state, or would it be a violation of the ICMA Code of Ethics for a city manager to surreptitiously record their elected official, even if it's legal in a one party consent state?
I don't know how it would be because if you think about
I,
it,
I
this
agree. I
organization
agree.
represents city managers from all throughout the country, and for not more than a few of them, it would be illegal. Even then, okay, thinking back to my first career, out of any of the careers that I've had, the only one where you could make the argument that it's okay to secretly record someone would probably be as a reporter. And in
Yeah.
James O'Keefe kind of way, investigative reporting, even then, I was always above board and pulled out the tape recorder and said, "This is to cover me, this is to cover you." One of the
Yeah.
reporters that I work with here locally does the same thing. "I'm recording this conversation. Are you okay with it?" So, yeah, to me, that's just an egregious violation of trust. But so it came back. They investigated it. Their investigation, they didn't harass this guy for a year the way they did with me. They came back a few weeks later and said, "Yeah, okay, we're done with this." So
Wait a
to
minute. Wait a
me,
minute. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. So you sit through a year long sort of investigation hanging over your head,
yeah,
and then you basically get cleared essentially, right? After a year, that's when you find out about it, and then you go to file a complaint against the city manager, and they basically dismiss it after a couple weeks and say, "No, there's nothing to see here. Move along."
exactly.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the people listening to this podcast, right? If you're an ICMA member, I want you to ask yourself this question: is it ethical or not to record your city council member without their knowledge? And I think most people are going to say, hey, that's not ethically okay to do so. So, if that's the case, how is it that the Oregon City County Management Association can have this situation where one city manager is filing an allegation against another city manager, but they're using this unethically obtained video or audio tape, right? Which doesn't even actually show that you did anything wrong, but they acquire this surreptitiously, and somehow the ICMA state chapter, the ethics committee, does not even go on their own and look into the ethics of that person. Like, it's just sort of, it's on you to file the complaint, and then when you do file the complaint, it just magically disappears 2 weeks later or three, whatever it was, in a short
Yeah,
period of time.
yeah, that was exactly it. And when they were closing out my matter, they were trying to say, "Well, you can't talk to other elected officials about things." And I'm thinking, you can't tell me that. I happen to know city councilors from one end of the state to the other, and some of them I've known for a long time through reporting and through other means. And it's part of what makes me effective is the fact that I can call these guys and say, "Hey, I remember your city was dealing with this issue years ago. How did you handle it?" And plus, it's just that basic freedom of association in the United States Constitution. And by then,
Right.
I had let my membership lapse. And my response, if you start with all due respect, it typically means the opposite, right? So I
Right.
said, with all due respect, in whatever measurable amount that may be, right? It was word for word what I said. And I said, you guys knew about this for a year. You did nothing. And I don't really care what you think. I let my membership lapse. Your organization has done literally nothing for me at any point. The only thing I have to show for it is this ludicrous investigation. There's been no mentoring, there's been no advice, and to me, you're talking earlier about do the citizens benefit from this? So, the citizens of Aurora for 3 years paid for me to belong to this organization and had nothing to show for it. Was there any value in me as a private individual digging out of my pocket to pay dues to belong to this member? Even less so, right? As opposed to
Yeah.
buying clothes for my kids or anything else I could be doing with it.
Especially when the organization is weaponizing the code of ethics against individuals. Like, that's the part that I find very
Yeah, and
troubling
what did
and
I do?
and
What was I
just
guilty of in the end? I was talking to a friend of mine, which I'm allowed
yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the whole thing just struck me as ludicrous, like all the way around.
So, Scott, I want to come back to an element of this conversation that we kind of maybe glossed over, and that is during the fact finding episode of this investigation into the allegation made against you by the city manager, you were accused essentially of leaking comments that he had made on the listserv to the public. Can you walk us through that a little bit? Because your position earlier, we talked about this again, obviously, was that you felt these are obviously a public record, but did you leak or share these messages from the listserv with anybody, or what was the basis for them accusing you of leaking?
Well, again, I mean, I'd never seen the complaint up to this point. So they said, well, we're going to have a fact-finding committee and we'll be reaching out to you. So that's how it came at me was this list of questions. Again, a very leading question. Why did you leak this email to the press? And I'm thinking, I don't even know the press down there. And I have worked in the press. I've worked for legislators helping them with press relations, but that's what I was being accused of was interfering in the politics of this town. Um,
But essentially, what we're getting at, I guess, the brass tacks of it, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that the members of the Oregon City County Management Association Ethics Committee were suggesting that if you had basically taken these listserv email exchanges and given them to somebody, whether it's in the media or elected official or anybody, they were essentially saying that you were violating something as far as the sanctity of the listserv, because that's supposed to be a private space that you can't really take outside the bounds of the listserv. Is that correct?
well, that contention is not correct because it's
Well,
nonsense, right? Because
well,
again, you're using public emails and everybody's on there using their public emails. So at that point, I did ask one of these guys. I said, "Okay, here's my list of questions for you. How many people are on this listserv? How many of them are using their public emails?" Right? And it comes back, oh, well, hundreds of people are on this listserv, and pretty well all of them are using their public emails. I said, well, there you go. So
yeah.
tell me again how this is some sort of safe space, like you guys are trying to make it out to be. And there's reason, again, why some of these guys don't want the public to see what they're posting on this listserv using their public emails, because they do frequently bash their citizens, they bash their counselors, they bash their mayors. And I think if those people knew, but again, getting back to just the nature of public emails, don't put something in a public email that you wouldn't want disclosed to the public. And similarly, I'm lucky in that the mayor of the town that I work in, that we have a really good working relationship. But if the opposite were true, and if I was going all over town bashing him publicly, right, privately, in print, otherwise, I would kind of expect that to get back to him. And would I really have any room for righteous indignation if that happened? If we said, "Hey, I know everyone in the world tells me that you're out there saying horrible things about me, including on your public email, right, before elected officials throughout the state." And what's my defense in that case? Oh, well, this listserv in which we're all using our public emails is a safe space.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an aspect of many of our peers, our colleagues, getting too comfortable and lax and just sort of thinking that that is a private space and it's really not. And so, if somebody's going to be saying something, and obviously we're all human beings, and we're going to let off steam, and we're all going to have our gripes and our bitches and our moans. I get it, but you got to be careful where you communicate that. I mean, you got to be careful where you share that
Right.
those thoughts and those sentiments. But I think the thing that I find disconcerting about the ethics committee process or this ethics investigation that you went through, and now grant this was a state level investigation, is that I've talked about this on LinkedIn and the podcast. I'm not against the idea of a code of ethics. Everyone says the ICMA, what
Right.
separates the ICMA from every organization is this code of ethics, this vaunted code of ethics. It's so important. It's extremely important for our profession, and it's what separates us from everybody else. But the problem I have with it is it seems to be, I don't think seems is the right word. It is used to carry out certain agendas, and it's not used
Even handedly.
yeah, exactly. It's not used in such a way that everybody is treated the same way when they go through an ethics investigation process, right? If that was the case, you wouldn't have been waiting for a year to find out that you had this surreptitiously recorded audio done by another city manager of their own elected official, and then yet you do an investigation, and in a couple weeks or a couple months or whatever it is, it's dismissed. It kind of reminds me of the, again, I don't want to belabor the James Freed situation. If, for those who are listening, go back to the first episode. I think it's episode 17 of the podcast, when I had James Freed on the show to talk about a situation. He sent a letter to CEO Mark Ott of the ICMA about Martha Perego's use of the Twitter handle, the ICMA Twitter handle, which was engaging in partisan political activity on Twitter. And
Yeah, you shouldn't be doing that.
right. Especially when you're the so-called ethics guru, right? And you're talking about,
Right.
Tenet 7 and all this other stuff. It's like the biggest no-brainer, but yet somehow even the ethics guru is so arrogant to think that they can get away with doing that. So it took them 9 months to figure out that James Freed had not shared this complaint with the public, right? As far as through the listserv or whatnot. It was, he'd done it privately with the CEO and with Martha as well. And yet it took them 9 months to clear him on this whole absurd idea that supposedly he had violated the confidentiality of an ethics investigation, right? Because when you make an ethics complaint or there's an ethics investigation, there's supposed to be confidentiality. But he's saying, hey, I never filed an ethics complaint against Perego, and I never asked for an ethics investigation into Perego. I simply sent a letter expressing my concerns to the CEO, and it was handled essentially by the CEO and what have you. How does it take 9 months to investigate whether or not an individual filed an ethics complaint when he could tell you point blank he didn't file an ethics complaint? It's so absurd. And yet, your situation, for example, it can be just dismissed out of hand. I filed an ethics complaint against Ray Beret, the CEO Mark Ott's chief of staff, because Ray Beret, I have evidence of him making campaign contributions to Democrat candidates and PACs.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah,
right?
no,
How absurd,
no.
right? The number two ranking person in the organization. Now, the difference between, say, the complaint that was filed against you and the complaint that was filed against me with the ELGL and whatever, and the complaint that I made to the ICM about Ray Beret, is I actually had receipts. I actually had documentation that said, hey, this person donated money to this candidate. This person donated money to this PAC. So there it is. Like, I'm not making just sort of an unfounded allegation and then asking the ethics committee to go investigate and find the facts for me. I'm presenting actual hardcore evidence saying, hey, this happened. And what do we get from the ICMA when it comes to the number two person in the organization? Crickets. There's just no conversation about it. There's no accountability. They won't tell you anything that happened. Clearly, he wasn't publicly censured, because if he was publicly censured, we would have heard about it. If there was any sort of punishment whatsoever, it was the classic private censure or whatever the case may be, which no one knows anything about. And it's just completely absurd to think that you can have
Hey,
the
have
number
your
two
wife
person in the
make the
organization.
donations instead, right? I mean,
Well,
that's what they did. They pulled him aside and said, or have your
there you
kids
go.
do it.
I know there's all different ways to get around it. So it's just, but here's the thing, and this is what I firmly believe. If you are part of the ICMA in crowd, if you're part of the in group or the clique or whatnot, you can kind of do whatever you want and get away with it, because no one challenges you or no one's going to call you out, because a lot of people are not going to go to bat and criticize the ICMA in public because they don't want the blowback on them professionally, right? You are a rare breed to come out and basically be so adamant and forceful in criticizing the ICMA either at the state or the national level. And what happens is, I think a lot of members in the ICMA have felt that they can do whatever the hell they want and not face any consequences because they're protected or they're in that in group. And I think it's created a lot of hubris, to be frank.
Oh yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree, and I've sat on this for 3 years, you know. But
What made you decide? What made you decide to go public about it now? Because you and I didn't really have a relationship at all until you reached out to me recently and said, "Hey, I got a story I'd like to share with you."
well, I see your posts on LinkedIn describing some of the podcasts and some of these James Freed situation, where I look at that and says, that reminds me of something that just hasn't sat well with me this whole time. Now, a lot of these positions do require membership. I'm seeing it less and less anymore. Yeah, in the OCCMA or the ICMA. So there's that, right? And I know he'd had some issues with their credentialing process, and he should. But I think cities and councilors are getting to realize that you don't want to limit your pool when it comes to that. A lot of Oregon cities used to have pretty stringent residency requirements. Well, that's fine, except there's no housing. So
Yeah.
sometimes that's the best you could do is look, I found a house half an hour away, and that's just, I mean, I live in Washington. My office is 6 miles from my house, so as close as it's going to get. You know, so if I had to be a Washington resident or a resident of the county, that'd be rough.
We have a peer, Scott, and I won't mention this person's name, but I just found out recently that this person took a job a year ago, and they took it in a region where housing is literally a local emergency issue. Okay,
Yeah,
because they just don't have housing. This individual, now get this. This is I'm gonna say it's either a city or a county manager, right?
yeah, a well
And
compensated
right,
white collar
yep,
individual.
yep. And him and his wife and kids are living in a double wide mobile home trailer behind a mortuary because that is the only option that he really has to have a house. And that's been their living condition for the last year. Now, that is not where somebody usually wants to raise a family.
Right? No,
Yeah,
some
yeah.
cities will actually buy a house, and that's part of the compensation package. They say, we will put you up in this house for as long as it takes you to have something. So, again, when I first started a few years ago, I saw more and more positions requiring membership. And look, at this point, I would still, if I had to, be willing to be part of the National Association. But the OCCMA, between that and the way I saw my colleagues conducting themselves during the pandemic, it just disgusted me. But when I look around, I think a lot of the folks that were on the ethics commission at the time have retired, so they're no longer city managers. So when I look at who's on there now, it looks like there's some new people, and I hope that they're at least more consistent. Because, at the end of the day, what you really need in that kind of membership association, people think it's not a political position, but that's naive. It is a political position because you're dealing with elected officials. And I've seen, and you've seen, and you've done several podcasts about this, as a city manager, you can get flogged big time by folks in the community, by your council, by your mayor, and I guarantee you, your professional association isn't going to step up and lift a finger to help you. And I don't know how they could, even if they wanted to, right? So maybe
Well, I
there's that
actually I do.
support.
Well, I think there's ways you can, and that's why I started AAME, the American Association of Municipal Executives, because I do think there are ways that you can stand up for managers. But you're right. The ICMA, the OCCMA, all the state chapters, none of them are going to lift a finger to stand up for
Oh,
city managers or county managers who are under attack. They've shown time and time again that they will not enter that space. That that's not something that they're going to go to battle on, and unfortunately, that's allowing so many of our peers to get their reputations damaged or destroyed. And it's also the bigger picture too is that when you have city managers and county managers across the country that are being subjected to the local political division, the partisanship that's going on, the social media smear tactics that are being
oh yeah.
used against them by the public, and you have pressures on compensation because oh, you can't pay a city manager that amount of money, that's too much money, yada yada yada, even though they're managing multi-million $100 million budgets. Why would anybody want to take this job? So eventually what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of mediocre talent entering the space because anybody who's worth their salt is not going to enter the profession because the compensation doesn't justify the risk or the scrutiny or the invasion of the privacy that so many of us have to endure. When I have city managers who are telling me that their kids are being texted by people in the community because of
Yeah.
something they may have done or they're being accused of doing or not doing, and it was like, why subject yourself and your family to that abuse? Why subject your family to having to move every couple of years because there's a change on the council? All for what? Because a job that might pay 120, 130, $140,000 a year, and everyone who's wants to bitch and moan about how overpaid the city manager is because it's so easy a caveman can do it. Well, then let's just let them start hiring any Tom, Dick, and Harry off the street to be a city manager and see what that gets them.
Because I was a reporter, in covering local government, I did see some city managers get dragged through the mud quite a bit over the years, and that was one of the things that made it seem like an unattractive profession to me. In fact, one of the guys that got dragged through the mud was one of the ones who eventually turned to me and said, "Hey, you could probably do this." And at that point, I was thinking, "Well, why would I?"
Right.
So okay, I have to go back to school, and being a reporter wasn't a great setup for grad school because you don't really have a set schedule, right? On paper, it's 9 to 5, but it's not. And well, I would do Wednesday night. classes, except I have city council that night. Oh, Saturday classes. Well, no, my US senator's coming to town, so I have to go cover the town hall meeting and then go shoot pictures at a volleyball game. Um, but it was this idea that at least if you're an elected official and people are out there bashing you, you have some forum or some ability to respond to it, right? But as the unelected bureaucrat, you have to sit on your hands. And it's true, people around town can say whatever they want about you, whether it's true or not. And it's bad form for you to get involved and say, hey, no, actually, that's not true, or here's what's really going on.
Defending yourself can actually cause you more professional heartache down the line.
Right, exactly, and I guarantee you that the ICMA isn't going to do anything to help you in that instance.
Yeah, yeah.
So, ultimately, it's up to those organizations to justify to their members and their would-be members, okay, you're going to pay us, and there's a reason that you're doing that. In the case of the Oregon City County Managers Association, I let my membership lapse. I haven't redone it. I mean, I still get emails ever so often. Hey, we're doing a membership drive. I said, well, that's great. Hopefully, you can, convince some people that there's value in membership. I saw none. So unless somebody insists that I belong, then I don't have any reason to, just based on my experience. But again, I would hope that the current leadership, because there's a generational change happening, and a lot of the folks that were involved were older people who had kind of an old school mentality. So maybe you get some new blood in there, and they have a different perspective, and maybe they can be more consistent with how they handle things. But based on my experience at this point in time, I don't want anything to do with them.
I think the main suggestion I would have probably for the ICMA at the national and state level with the state chapters is to focus more on providing equal treatment under the enforcement when it comes to investigating ethics abuses or violations. I just don't
Follow
think that
your
they're
own
doing that.
rules.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's actually, yeah, that's even better put. Yeah, follow your own rules because obviously they've had a history of not even following their own rules when it comes to how they operate. We've talked about that time and time again. Whether it's the James Freed investigation when they didn't use the state fact finding committee to investigate what actually happened, and they end up publicly censuring him and running him out of the organization,
Well,
even
what's
though they
crazy
didn't
was
follow
even
the rules.
in this investigation, they never once talked to my friend. They never once talked to the guy who was being secretly recorded. Right? You figure
Really?
yeah, any investigation that, if you're really going to be serious about it, because I'm sure the first thing he would have said is, I had no idea this guy is recording me.
Yeah.
Right? That's outrageous. That's an egregious violation of trust. I can't believe he did that. I'm glad we fired him. I mean, I'm sure he would have said something along those lines. But they never bothered to reach out to him at any point. No email, no phone call, right? So you figure, is it worth it to do your due diligence? I mean, that's literally the entire investigation consisted of this secret recording. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Well, the investigations that the ICMA conducts are shoddy at best, and partisan and personal in nature at worst. So I will leave it there. Hey, Scott, I really appreciated you coming on the show and sharing your story. It's pretty alarming and disgusting what you've had to endure, but it's not uncommon, unfortunately. And I've heard other stories from other managers throughout the last 18 months or so that I've been on LinkedIn and doing the podcast, but very few will ever come on the podcast to talk about it because they don't want to be publicly critical of the ICMA for some obvious reasons. But I appreciate you having the courage to come on the show and talk about it because you're one of the rare breeds, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for being on.
Yeah, I know, and I went back and forth on that for a while, but I think ultimately you start to see a pattern. And just knowing that I'm not alone and hearing what's happening to some of these other guys, and I appreciate you having me on. And hey, if you need some bumper music, I can offer up, anything off of our first album. We got the next album in the works. So, um,
What is the name of your band?
robots building robots.
Robots Building Robots?
Yes.
And how do people find you, or where would you be? Are you on Spotify at this point? I don't even know. So
We
how do?
are, yes, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Spotify, iTunes. That's our first album. The one that should be out later on this year will absolutely crush that one. So I'll be sure to
I will
send
link
it
to it in the
over to
show
you.
notes.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
appreciate
And I'll
that.
yeah, I'll link to it in the show notes. And awesome. Thanks for being on the show, Scott. I'm Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. I appreciate your support. Thank you for all the ratings and reviews you left over the last year. Thank you for subscribing and following. I'm just so blessed and so blown away by the support you guys have shown me. And this is the first episode in year 2, and I'm hoping we're going to be doing this for many, many more years to come. So thank you very much, and have a great day.